Hi, fourth grade. My name is Miss Kelly, and I'm the director here at the Ephraim Historical Foundation. We're so sorry that we can't come be with you in person this year because of COVID. We've been working hard to put together a series of videos for you so that you won't miss us hardly at all. Today we're coming to you live from the Goodletson Cabin right next to the one-room schoolhouse in Ephraim. You might remember these buildings from your field trip here to Ephraim last year.
We'd like to welcome the fourth graders to the Ephraim Historical Foundation's presentation of what life was like during the earliest days in Ephraim, from the 1850s to about 1890. And one of our very first homes in Ephraim is where Miss Sal and I'm Marla, Miss Marla, are standing right now, and that's the Goodletson Cabin. The Goodletson Cabin was originally constructed on Horseshoe Island, or Eagle Island as it was called, when you learned about Ole Larson and his life on the island in an earlier video. The cabin was brought across the ice because it was easier to live within the confines of the mainland than to be out on the island by yourself all the time. So please follow us into the cabin. I'd like to welcome you inside the Goodletson Cabin and give you an idea of what life was like on the frontier many, many years ago. When Reverend Iverson and the band of Moravian settlers first came to the Ephraim area, it was not exactly what they expected. The soil was full of rocks, and this would be a small one. In order to be able to farm at all, they had to get the rocks out of the field, and they had to use the rocks. So the rocks became fences that many of you will still see today as you drive through Ephraim.
They used oxen instead of horses for most of the heavy work that they had to do. And this would have been an ox yoke. So there would have been two oxen that would have been hooked up to this, and they would have been used to plow and to haul stone sledges, to build stone walls along the edges of the field.
It was so difficult for people to exist on farming on this rocky soil that they quickly looked to other ways to earn a living. Fishing and lumbering became two important ways that people could earn money in the earliest days of Ephraim. The weather's just starting to have a bit of a chill, but I'd like you to close your eyes and imagine January, when it's so cold outside and we're all bundled up in our houses with heat. But what did the pioneers and settlers do? They did not have heat like we did. Obviously, they had fireplaces, and after being here a few years, some were able to afford a nice stove, and that would throw off heat and allow them to be able to cook.
One of the first things that the settlers would have actually had to pay money for, and that would have been delivered to the Anderson dock via schooner, would be one of the heating stoves. This was used for heat and for cooking. It was a wood stove, of course, and they used it for a multitude of reasons, for ironing, fluting, cooking, making coffee. One of the other things that they would do is they would make their own butter. If they were lucky enough to have a cow or have friends who they could buy milk from, they would use one of the old-fashioned butter churns. And once the butter had been processed and was separated from the whey, they would use a butter bowl to push the extra liquid out of the butter and make it usable for their cooking and for the other, frying and so on.
The kitchen was the center of the one-room log cabin. All the cooking, the cleaning, taking care of the children, and any prized possessions would have been in one small cupboard because that would be all they'd have room for. As we look into this cupboard, we see just what we would keep in a cupboard today, but far less material possessions than we might have. You might be wondering how we lit up our homes, especially during the long, dark days during the winter. Earliest would be making a candle in the candle molds, and they would melt tallow or animal fat, whatever they had, so candles didn't always smell good. And then, of course, once they hardened in the molds with the wick, they would take them out and use them as we would today. Well, candles lit houses up for a while, but people wanted something a little bit better. So we move into using oil with the kerosene lights. But you had to be careful because, you had fires back in the early days too. So nothing was ever left unattended, especially in a log cabin. Chores were endless when you were living in a one-room log cabin, and everything had to be done in the cabin, especially during the winter months. This is a washboard. This would be your washing machine. And you would have to heat your water on the stove using your homemade soap, scrub your clothes clean, rinse them, twist them dry, and then hopefully hang them on some kind of a line to get the last of the water out. During the earliest days of Ephraim history, your mom had to wear several hats. Not only was she the cook and the laundry, but she also was the doctor. There was no doctor in the early days. So when you weren't feeling well, it was over-the-counter remedies, and the counter would be Anderson's store. Your mom would hike on down to the store, which you might remember from your third grade field trip, and we'll take you there in another video. And she would get remedies that you might recognize. Tell me when. You want me to start again?
Yeah, just go ahead.
Okay. This box doesn't look very different than a box you might see in your home today. Arm & Hammer baking soda. And it is good for many different remedies, including an upset stomach. It also will keep things fresh if you open a box and stick it in a cabinet. In terms of medicine bottles, this is actually a glass bottle, and it says Johnson & Johnson on it. And you would use perhaps aspirin out of this bottle and then go back down to the store and have it refilled with more medicine. So you're saving the containers, which is actually a very good idea. Another remedy that you might remember from the past is Epsom salts. And even today, you might want to soak in these if you have some sore muscles. How did we get around in early Ephraim? Well, it wasn't easy. We did have horse, and we did have oxen, but most of the time you're going to be on your own. If it's winter, here are snowshoes. You just strap yourself in, and these were very efficient ways of getting around. Also, ice skates, if you're going to be on the frozen bay. And, of course, you just strap in. They didn't come in sizes. You had to just use the straps to strap your foot in for the right size. And you might recognize on the wall skis. Earliest kind of cross-country skiing, which would be another way to get around. That would also be fun. Families were large in the early days of Ephraim, even though the log cabins were not too big. So typically you would have mom and dad on the first floor, and of course no indoor plumbing, so you'd be washing up with your pitcher and your wash basin off to the corner. And the very many children, other than the youngest of babies, would be up in a loft that would go across the whole top of the cabin floor. So everybody at night would go up there and unroll their bedding, and that's where you would be. And of course the expression, don't let the bed bugs bite. Sometimes that bedding would come with bugs if it had corn husks or straw or other things in it. But that would be the least of your concerns during the winters in Ephraim. So at this point, you might be wondering, if there's no indoor plumbing, how did people take care of necessities, especially in the middle of the night? You might not want to go outside where there might be animals roaming or it was so cold. So adults would have a chamber pot under their bed, and you can use your imaginations. But for the littlest ones, you might recognize what this is. This would be one of the very first potty chairs. and that would let a little one have a little bit of support. So they did find ways to take care of all their needs during those cold, dark winters in Ephraim.
We're at the Goodletson Cabin right now. However, I'm going to be talking about the German settlement, which was up beyond Town Line Road. If you go up Highway Q, which many of you are familiar with, the German settlement ran from nearly Sister Bay, starting mostly at Highway Q, and running down to Bailey's Harbor. The Germans in the German settlement also built log cabins. Some of them looked like this, some of them had round logs. And many of the houses that you see covered with white siding actually are log cabin underneath. They built the log cabins because it was easy and cheap to get up, but they wanted to belong to show that they were prospering, and so they put siding over the logs as soon as they could. On the road, Highway Q, that goes up to Town Line Road and past Town Line Road, there were two brothers named Staver, two German immigrants who each built their own farm and lived next to each other. And you might recognize some of their descendants. The Bristol children and the Mitterman children are descendants of their great-grandparents and great-great-grandparents, the Stavers. The Germans who settled in the German settlement were farmers rather than the fishermen who were the Scandinavians in the village of Ephraim. And it was very rough go for them economically because they had poor soil, lots of rocks, and so they were subsistence farmers for many years.